Let's welcome Susan Jones, lead academic of English language at the Trinity College London. Hi Susan.
Hello, unmuting the microphone. How are you
Okay,
today?
don't worry, I'm good. So I'm going to put your presentation,
Okay,
and the stage is yours. Thank you.
thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you had a great lunch. I've really been enjoying the conference so far. I'm sure you've all found some really, really useful information and ideas being shared. So today, for this session, what I'm hoping to talk to you about a little bit is around creating assessments that promote learning, but it's much about the philosophy or the principles behind wanting assessment to serve this purpose. And so that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, why we do this and what the effect can be for the learners in our classrooms, the students in our classrooms. So the first question is kind of a fundamental one. Why do we assess? What is it that we're trying to learn or trying to do? And it kind of comes down to the difference between, are we looking to the past, something that's already happened, or something that we're doing, that we're looking to the future, what comes next? So think about the tests that you give to your students. Do they test what the student was supposed to learn and what you taught? Or do they give us a picture of where the student is now with feedback about what they need to do next? So most of the time, a lot of the time, summative assessment at the end of the year or at the end of the semester is about looking back. Have the students learned what they were supposed to learn? Did they learn what was in the textbook? Did they learn what we taught? And what is their grade? But formative assessment, which teachers conduct throughout the year to check whether students are learning the skills they need, whether they can apply the skills in new situations, giving feedback for the students about what they still need to work on and how to close the gap. This is about looking to the future. What can students do now? And where are they relative to the defined learning outcomes? And what are the attributes of success? This is what we look at with formative assessment. And this is where student learning can really be increased if we bring them in as part of the learning process. So generally, we might say that teachers need a strong foundation in assessment literacy in order to create these assessment opportunities that promote learning. An assessment should always have a positive impact on teaching and learning. But even without formal training, teachers can make changes in their practice if there's a mismatch between what we want our students to learn and the tests that we're giving. So first of all, just to mention something, constructive alignment, which some of you are probably quite familiar with. In an ideal world, this is what we would like to see, that the curriculum and the learning outcomes and the textbook and the teaching and the assessment are all perfectly aligned, and that the skills that we're teaching the students in the classroom are the very same skills that we're going to be testing at the end of the year. But often this is not what teachers have to deal with. Sometimes, teachers go into the classroom and they're expected to know how to create assessments for their students, but they maybe haven't had assessment literacy as part of their teacher education program. And in spite of increasing attention on language assessment literacy in recent years, it's still not included in most teacher education. So teachers learn about teaching language, they learn about teaching the skills, but they don't necessarily learn about how to assess whether students are acquiring the skills that they need so that they'll be available to them when they go out into the real world and they need to draw on those language skills. And unfortunately, a lot of the assessment, the testing that happens right now, focuses on reading and writing. So there often isn't much space left in the year to focus on speaking and listening. But communication skills are often the most important skills students need to learn. This is how they take their interview to get into university or to get their job. This is how they make their first impression. In the last 16 months, this is how most of us are teaching and learning and working. And so communication skills are really fundamental to success. And yet these are the skills that we tend to neglect in our teaching. So let's talk a little bit about this term washback. Ultimately, what this means is the effect that tests have on teaching and learning. And a lot of times when we said in teacher education, we're focused on what we teach, what we do as teachers. But ultimately, the tests that we give or what have the greatest impact on what happens in the classroom. Because we as teachers will teach for the test, and learners want to learn what's going to be on the test so that they can be successful. So if the tests don't align with the skills that we want the students to be learning, then we're going to have a bit of a gap in what students are going to leave our classes with. So the goal for assessment is to have an assessment which has a positive impact on teaching and learning. This is what we call positive washback. So teachers need to have more knowledge and confidence to create and use a wide range of assessments which more authentically test and assess the skills that we want students to actually learn. And then teachers give feedback to students on how well they're achieving the outcomes and what they need to continue to practice. So this becomes what we call a virtuous cycle of teaching and learning and testing and feedback, which gives students kind of personal agency in the learning process and will have a positive impact on what they learn. Because assessment literacy isn't just about making a better test, although this is a really important part of the process, having better tests that test the skills we want to teach, but it's also about what we're doing in the classroom to promote learning. And there's multiple ways that we can evaluate learning, that we can assess students, and we can give them feedback so they have more ownership of their own learning journey. And even when we have a curriculum in place and a textbook in place and perhaps large classes and important end-of-year exams, we can still make small steps within our own classrooms to introduce more elements of active learning, of communicative language teaching and learning, and formative assessment inside of our classes. So let's think a little bit about different attitudes about teaching and learning, kind of teachers' attitudes. So sometimes we think about teaching, we think about our students, we kind of put students in boxes. This is what the student is. This is a smart student, or this is a kind of lazy student, or this is a student who's probably a little bit behind and just isn't going to catch up. And this attitude about who our students are will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The good students will succeed and the bad students will fail. And it really doesn't allow us to give students as many opportunities as they should have to achieve the learning outcomes. So another kind of attitude about teaching, or way to think about teaching and assessing, is to think about what the teacher does. And this makes the focus of the classroom and the focus of the assessment on whether the teacher has been successful in teaching the textbook or teaching the concepts. And so the assessment really isn't about what the students have done, it's about what the teacher has done. So the third level of assessment of attitude about teaching and learning is thinking about what the student does. And this is where we can really start to think about how to focus on what the student is doing, their engagement, their active engagement with the learning. And it also allows us to open up the classroom, the assessment, to all students. All students have the opportunity to demonstrate achievement of the learning outcomes, to get feedback about their performance. And learning and engagement will increase dramatically for all students, no matter where they're starting from. And so what we want to do, the CEFR, which you'll be familiar with, is presented as can-do statements. And this is what formative assessment should do. It should focus on what students can do, what they can't do yet, and provide a roadmap for improvement. And then the assessment and the learning become one process. They're not separated. So just quickly to have a look at Bloom's taxonomy that you're all probably familiar with. And we know that a lot of assessment that takes place in the classroom really focuses on the first 2 or 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Learning details, learning facts, asking comprehension questions, maybe applying the information a little bit, but very often we don't really challenge students to move into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So students spend a lot of time memorizing, learning information. They keep it in their mind long enough to take the test. And then as soon as the test is over, they don't remember what they've learned, and they really can't apply the skills and knowledge that they've learned in the real world. So that's why this focus on using the language actively in new situations and contexts, and not just demonstrating knowledge of grammar or vocabulary or discrete bits of language, is really important and critical for student learning. So let's take a look at two different kinds of learning, surface learning and deep learning. So these are very much driven by those attitudes about teaching and learning that we just looked at. There's absolutely a space for memorization, for repetitive tasks, to get students to kind of learn new concepts as they're just beginning to learn them. But in order for the learning to really become cemented in our minds and to move to our long-term memory, it must be actively engaged with and applied repeatedly in the learning process. Otherwise, it just becomes something we remember for the test, and then we forget it to make way for new information that we need to remember for another test. And if most of our focus in the classroom is either on who students are, or what we're doing as teachers, it's really hard to get past that surface learning. But if we can think about what students are doing and create opportunities in the classroom for students to really engage and to apply what they're learning in our classroom in new situations and new contexts, then it will lead to deeper learning. So then the question becomes, what kind of learning do we want to promote? So surface learning, sometimes that there are factors that lead to our students kind of engaging in surface learning that are not necessarily in our control as teachers, but certainly some of the barriers to learning. We can address some of the barriers to learning by giving students opportunities to succeed and giving them feedback on what they're doing well and what they still need to work on, and using different means of assessment than just waiting for the end of the year and the high stakes exam, giving students more opportunities to see progress, to see their own progress, and to work towards achieving the learning outcomes. And that's why we want to focus on moving our students away from surface learning and more towards deeper learning. And again, some of the factors are very much intrinsic in the learner, that some learners are just more interested in coming into the classroom and learning. But teachers play a huge role in helping more learners see the possibilities and increase motivation to engage in this kind of learning by giving the students clear learning outcomes and giving them multiple opportunities to demonstrate what they've learned and what they can do, and giving them feedback. And it's really important to make sure that all learners, maybe especially those who are weaker students or who are struggling or who are a little farther behind, to give them opportunities to show improvement and to make progress, and then ultimately to meet learning outcomes, which are criterion referenced and not norm referenced, because ultimately the goal is to increase student learning and to give students the skills and knowledge that they need to use the language when they leave school. It's not just about assigning a grade on a bell curve, but it's about increasing student learning and student motivation. So if we look at this chart and kind of thinking about these concepts of engagement with learning and the method of teaching, we can see that if we move past, this is not exactly based on Bloom's taxonomy, but the frameworks are similar, that if we move past those basic levels of learning, those surface levels of learning, where students are applying what they're learning, theorizing, creating new things, and we have high levels of active engagement by students, that's where the best learning is going to take place. If we're only focused on memorizing and remembering information, and if the teaching is the primary focus of the classroom so that the learning becomes a passive activity, we know that we can't help students achieve all that is possible. So when students are challenged to apply what they're learning in these new contexts, that's when we'll achieve the greatest outcomes for the students and satisfaction for us as teachers as well. So one of the concepts that comes up quite a lot when we're talking about assessment literacy is something called assessment for learning. And this is a philosophy, a practice, a methodology, whatever we want to call it. But the ultimate outcome of assessment for learning is about students getting feedback on what they're learning, on how they're doing, on how they're able to use the language, and students start to develop a better understanding of what they can do and what they still need to work on. So students take ownership, actual engagement with their own learning process, and they can start to direct their own learning. They're not simply waiting for the teacher to tell them what to do next. And one of the key outcomes of assessment for learning is that we're wanting to promote learning and not just measuring it or giving a grade for what has already happened in the past, that we're using this as a way of looking to what's possible for the future. And some of these assessment practices that promote deeper learning, that promote deeper engagement with the learning outcomes, are activities such as task-based learning or project-based learning, where the teaching and the learning and the assessment are all part of one cycle. And when the assessment is done, the students receive feedback, which allow them to move on to the next stage of learning. And all of this type of assessment is about helping the students achieve the skills and knowledge that they need to have. It's not just about the end of year assessment or making the best grade. It's about really learning and internalizing those skills that students need to be able to use their language skills successfully after school. And some practices that sometimes we don't think about, often where we get into the routine of reading and writing, students writing essays to demonstrate something that they've learned, but giving students choices about the format of assessment based on their preferences. Maybe not everybody needs to be assessed exactly the same way. And so students being able to make videos or make posters or do a presentation as an alternative to just writing an essay can be a really liberating way to allow students to demonstrate what they're learning. And it's also really important to think about integrated skills assessment, that assessment is not about each one of the skills being learned and then assessed separately. In the real world, we use the skills together, speaking and listening, reading and writing, of course, that we're familiar with, but even listening into writing tasks or reading into speaking tasks, or to switch the speaking and listening paradigm, listening into speaking tasks, and elevating the importance of the listening skill as part of the communication process. That all of these kinds of day-to-day activities, of learning activities, are actually assessment activities. And it's ways for students to show us what they've learned and what they can do, and a way for teachers to be able to give feedback to help students on their learning journey. And one of the reasons, as we're coming to a close here, of why this is so important is that if we think about the skills that our students really need to have when they finish school, what is it that we want them to be able to do? And when we see surveys of employers and ask them about the kinds of skills they want new employees, new hires to have, we see very common lists of skills. And of course, these will all be familiar to you. But almost always at the top of the list is communication skills and critical thinking and an ability to work together in teams and collaborate. And creativity is increasingly seen as a really important skill for students, for young workers to come into the workplace with. Very rarely do you ever hear employers say that what they want is for students to know a lot of facts or to have all the information, because they can learn that when they start working. And never do you hear them say students need to have good test-taking skills. And yet, a lot of the assessment that we give in school for end-of-year assessment, that's precisely what students are focusing on. They're focusing on, apologies, how do I do well on the test? How do I make a good grade on this test so I can move on to the next test? And so much of the assessment that we currently do in school focuses on the test, which then has a really negative impact on the classroom, because the classroom ends up being focused on how to do well on the test, rather than using that time and that opportunity to focus on helping students learn communication skills and critical thinking skills and increase their creativity. And just as a final note, I was looking at some research from Latin America recently, and one of the facts that was one of the ideas that was promoted in the research was that in surveys of employers was the idea that speaking English fluently can increase a young person's earning opportunities as much as graduating from secondary school, and about half as much as earning a bachelor's degree. So when we talk about increasing students' communication skills with language, it's not just an academic or theoretical discussion that we're having. It really is a way for them to change their lives. And so this focus on students learning the skills they need for their life after school really is quite critical for their success. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. I would like to close by saying, we all know that assessment is really hard. Good assessment is hard, because if it were easy, of course, we would all do it and we wouldn't be here talking about it. But that's why it's so important to think about small things that we can do in our classes to help ensure that students have the best opportunity to learn the skills that they need and to be successful when they leave school. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Susan. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Patricia Amada, she is asking, are the levels that divided?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the first part of that question.
Don't worry. Are the levels that divided? She puts like that way.
Well, I think it's not necessarily a progression of levels. It's more kind of different attitudes about teaching and learning. And a lot of times we tend to get focused on those lower, levels 1 and 2 by, kind of prescribing who we think the students are and then treating them that way for the whole class, for the whole year, and not necessarily giving them more opportunities to show that maybe we're wrong about them. Maybe they can do something more if we give them an opportunity. And level 2 is just the focus is very much on what I do as the teacher. So all of the responsibility becomes about what I'm doing rather than what the students are doing. And then level 3, so it's not necessarily hierarchical levels, it's more just different ways of thinking about the classroom. And if we can shift our focus away from just what we do as teachers, but really focus on what students are doing with the information that they're learning, that's where we can start to make real changes in the classroom. But it requires us to give students a little bit more ownership and control, and perhaps us giving up a little bit of control, which isn't always easy to do as a teacher.
Thank you, Susan. Newton Monteiro asked, do you think it's appropriate for teachers to prepare specifications or table of specifications even for non-traditional alternative assessment tasks?
To prepare a specification?
Yeah, to prepare specifications or table of specifications, even for non-traditional alternative assessment tasks.
Right, okay. Yes, I think it's really important, in fact, that we do that, because what we want to do is to try and be really clear about what the learning objectives are, and telling students right up front, here's what we're trying to achieve, and here's what we want to learn, and giving students the opportunity then to really know what they're trying to achieve, so that it's not dependent on me as the teacher to always be in control, but that students absolutely understand what the end point is and that they can work to achieve those goals. And that's where sometimes we can be really surprised by students who will do more than we expect them to do. Or sometimes, students become very interested in a topic, and then because they're interested in it and have a personal stake in it, they'll learn much more than we might have covered in the classroom. And so if we start in the very beginning of these types of projects and these types of activities by telling students what the end result is that we're looking for, then oftentimes I think I'm surprised by what students can do. It's normally much more than I would have expected.
Thank you, Susan. Nick Zimmer, he wrote, comments on reducing time needed to assessment different assignments.
Yes, well, this is always the challenge, isn't it? Trying to find the right balance. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is maybe thinking about assessment not as a separate activity, always as something kind of additional or another burden for the teacher, but that it becomes a very routine part of the way that we teach. And sometimes, when we're observing students or watching them working in groups, we're making decisions or, we're assessing them but it's not necessarily a sit down and to take a quiz or a test and something that has to be marked by the teacher. So I think I absolutely understand. We can't minimize the importance of how much teachers have to do, and it is hard work. But sometimes if we have students working in groups and we are using some peer assessment and some self-assessment, or we're assessing making some decisions about students as we're observing them working, then it becomes just a part of the teaching and learning process. And a lot of times the purpose of the assessment is not to assign a grade, but to be able to give some feedback to that student about what they're doing well or what they need to work on, or for ourselves to learn about where students might be struggling in order to adapt our teaching to make sure that those important concepts are learned by the whole class. So the purpose of the assessment is to inform the teaching process and not necessarily to assign grades. And so I think that's where we find ways to incorporate more assessment practice into the regular teaching and learning process and not thinking about it as a separate activity all the time.
Susan, now the question is, how can that be quantified?
Well, the very first question that I asked in the beginning is why are we testing? Why are we assessing in the first place? And some tests are very much about giving grades. It's the end of the semester. It's the end of the year. Did students learn the things that they needed to learn? And we won't ever be able to get away from those types of tests. But in between, there's a whole lot of teaching and learning and assessing that can take place that's about helping students continue along the pathway and to continue to make progress. And so sometimes it can be quantified if we have our learning outcomes and we set up our rubric to say, here's what we want to see and here's how it's going to be marked. We can assign grades for this type of formative assessment, but it doesn't always have to be about grades. Sometimes it can be about students, are they learning what they need to learn? And are they able to, do they have opportunities to be creative, to show us skills or abilities that maybe we hadn't even thought to ask about? And so it always comes back to the first question is about why are we assessing in the first place? And the answer to that is it's not always about grades or ranking students. That sometimes it's just about making sure that the learning progresses.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. So the first one is from Catherine Diaz. She is asking, how can we help students to be more honest in self-assessment?
Well, probably part of this is for them to understand the learning outcomes. So to be really clear about what our expectations are in terms of what they need to show, what do they need to demonstrate? Because yes, of course, sometimes students, even in peer assessment, they find it hard to critique each other or to say something negative about their peer, and we certainly find that hard to do in self-assessment. But ultimately, if the goal is here and I can only achieve at this level, when it comes to the final assessment, I'm not going to do as well because I wasn't honest about what I could actually do. And I think if we can engage students more in the conversation about what is the ultimate goal, where are we now, what are our strengths and weaknesses, and giving them feedback about what they can do to close that gap, to do better than they're doing right now, and not just leaving it 100% on the student to think about what they need to do to improve, but for us as the teacher to give them feedback and to give them guidance on how they can perform better. Because ultimately, as I said, the end of year exam still sits there, kind of whatever the students have to achieve in order to follow the curriculum and the textbook and the school guidelines that are in place, we still have to do those things. So if we're not honest in our self-assessment, we really only hurt ourselves ultimately. And so I think it's just about bringing students into the conversation and helping them see the benefits of evaluating themselves honestly and figuring out how they can improve.
Thank you. And our last question is from Liberato Silva. He says, could you please share some current literature or bibliography on the theme of creating assessment that promote learning? So if you have some reference or pages.
I can share something, perhaps. I mean, I've left my email. Oops. But I don't know if I left it up long enough for everyone to see it. I guess it'll be available in the bio data for the course. So you're welcome to send me an email, and I'd be happy to share some literature with you on more than anything. What I would say is that we have to think about those small things that we can do within our classrooms and within, the confines of all the other work that we have to do as teachers, that it's not easy to make wholesale changes, but sometimes just small changes in our practices. But I'm happy to share some literature if you'd like to write.
Thank you, Susan. Time is over. So now I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. It was great.
Thank you very much. It was real joy. And everyone enjoy the rest of the conference. It's been really great so far. Thank you all for organizing it so well.